We are in Hebrews chapter 9. We're going to finish up chapter 9. And before we get going into the Bible study, I want to just open up a general question here. What are your thoughts on YOLO? First off, are you guys familiar with the saying YOLO? You only live once. Okay, all right. So what are your thoughts on the statement YOLO, you only live once? Good and bad? Can you elaborate? Sure, so it's good in the sense that, you use your life since you've only got the one. You don't let yourself be held down by worry and stuff. But it's bad in the sense if you use it as an excuse to do just a bunch of stupid stuff. Okay, I can get behind that. Anybody else? No opinions today, huh? Yeah. So kind of a little bit of a theological squabble on that one, huh? Yeah, I get that. Yeah, I have to say most of the people that I've heard saying YOLO are usually younger people who are doing something real stupid. YOLO, it's like, hey, that I guess means why you should kill your brain cells. Like, I don't know, whatever. Anybody else before I move on? There is a reason why I'm saying that, okay? It's going to work in. Sometimes people live as if they'd never die. I'm immortal. I've got my strength of my youth, and I shall never perish. And then sometimes people go to the other extreme, and it's like death is imminent for them. Even to the fact that sometimes they're not even on their deathbed. They're just like, 20, 30 years of, my death is imminent. And tonight we're going to look at a couple things, and the YOLO thing is going to come up. Okay, I swear it is. It's not just an off-the-wall thing that I said. But tonight we're gonna look at two main things. First off, we're gonna look at the next two reasons why God's covenant is superior, and then second off, we're gonna see a verse that's often very misused and is not understood in its context. So some very interesting things tonight. Just to review what we looked at before, we looked at verses 15 through 22, which basically taught us that blood is necessary for covenant. And we looked at last week, we looked at the first of the three reasons why Christ's covenant is superior, and that is because the blood was his. It's a superior covenant because the blood of the sacrifice that was offered was his very blood. So now we can go and we're going to read through the passage, Hebrews 9:22 through 28, and then we're just going to break it down. Anybody want to read this for us?
Therefore it was necessary for the copies of the things in the heavens to be purified with these sacrifices, but the heavenly things themselves to be purified with better sacrifices than these. For Christ did not enter a sanctuary made with hands, only a model of the true one, but into heaven itself, so that he might now appear in the presence of God for us. He did not do this to offer himself many times, as the high priest enters the sanctuary yearly with the blood of another. Otherwise, he would have had to suffer many times since the foundation of the world. But now he has appeared one time at the end of the ages for the removal of sin by the sacrifice of himself. And just as it is appointed for people to die once, and after this judgment, so also Christ, having been offered once to bear the sins of many, will appear a second time, not to bear sin, but to bring salvation to those who are waiting for him.
Morgan, can you do me a huge favor? Close down ProPresenter and open this up as a PowerPoint so it can reach the whole screen. We haven't fixed that little problem that we've stumbled upon. We'll give her just a minute, okay? I think it'll be easier for me to see these next things with the slide up. Yeah, it's on the bottom left side of the screen. It's separated from the other ones. More towards the center than the left. Now would be a perfect time if I had any jokes in the back of my hat. So we'll be on slide 15. Just in case you forgot what we did and what we talked about, look real quick, guys. Hope you're fast readers. So, so in the first section, which is verses 22 through 24, it gives us the second of the three reasons why Christ's covenant was superior, and that's because the place of the offering was in heaven versus in the earthly tabernacle. So this leads us to another Jewish question. Remember, Hebrews is a book that's written to Jews. So they're asking a lot of questions that we don't think about because we're not Jewish. And one of the things that that a Jew would ask is, why was a sacrifice, if Jesus was a sacrifice, why was a sacrifice not given at the temple? Because sacrifices were only accepted if they were given at the temple. So why? How's that possible? And this verses 22 through 24 are actually going to talk about that. How could it possibly be accepted? Because it could be accepted because the sacrifice was better. It was better than the other sacrifice. So, when you get to here, I'll read through it again. Therefore, it was necessary for the copies of the things in the heavens to be purified with these sacrifices, but the heavenly things themselves to be purified with better sacrifices than these. For Christ did not enter a sanctuary made with hands, only a model of the true one, but into heaven itself, so that he might now appear in the presence of God for us. So we can move forward from here and say, okay, notice in verse 23 that it said that both of them had to be purified, didn't it? Did you guys catch that? I'll read it again. In verse 23 it says, it was necessary for the copies of the things to be purified, then down at the end, but the heavenly things themselves to be purified with better sacrifices. Which brings us, I think, to a pretty obvious question. Why on earth did heaven have to be purified? Well, it wasn't because the place was defiled, okay? The place was where God dwelt, okay? This is, if you want a clearer picture of what's being said, read Leviticus 16. It talks about this. See, God's presence was in the Holy of Holies, in the tabernacle in the wilderness with the Jews, right? Remember back before they ever had the promised land, they were just wanderers, right? And they had the tabernacle. God's presence dwelt in the tabernacle. But they still went in every year to purify it, didn't they? Why was that necessary? See, and it's pretty much exact same reason in both accounts why the earthly one had to be purified and the heavenly one. And that's because the place was not defiled, but God dwelt there. So rather, people, okay, unclean people, sinful people, rebellious people, they had to be atoned for. See, they defiled it. So the Day of Atonement was about purifying what Israel had contaminated. Make sense? So in the same way in heaven, Jesus purified it because we, sinners, are going into heaven. So he purified it because of our rebellion, because of our sin. So his blood, I know when we talk about Christ, the sacrifice, and Jesus dying for us and all that, we talk about our forgiveness, but we very rarely talk about the way that his death, his sacrifice, also purified heaven so that we could approach God, so we could approach him. So let's move on from there and say, okay, so the answer to the Jewish question, why wasn't his blood brought to the temple? Because it was brought directly to heaven, to the presence of God. Obviously not literally. I'm not trying to argue that there was an angel that collected the blood like they would have in the Old Covenant. I'm not trying to argue that. But his blood was brought to heaven rather than the earthly temple. Now, if you notice at the end of verse 24, it says this, so that he might now appear in the presence of God for us. Now, this is extremely important. I know it's something we just skipped over. I really did. George Guthrie's commentary is the only reason why I've been stopped twice on this part. Notice that he didn't say for us and himself, as was true for the earthly priests. It was just for us. He didn't have to do it for him. He was already good. He did it totally for us. And it doesn't really expand too much on that here because he already talked about it before. So then when we get to verses 25 to 26, we're going to get into the third of three reasons why Christ's covenant was superior, and that's because the offering was eternal. So now we have the three reasons. So first off, the blood of the sacrifice was his, the place of the sacrifice was in heaven, and the offering itself was eternal. This is the three main arguments of the end of this half of chapter 9 that tell us why Christ's covenant was superior. So in verses 25 through 26, and I'll read it real quick, he did not do this to offer himself many times, because remember, we've been trying to figure out this question for many chapters now. Why did one sacrifice from Jesus, why was that good enough when in the Old Testament you had to have all kinds of different sacrifices? Why did it not have to be repeated? And how come it was good enough for all of the different sins? That's not how the Old Testament law worked. So how does it work with Jesus? So we're going to start answering that. He did not do this to offer himself many times as the high priest enters the sanctuary yearly with the blood of another. Otherwise, he would have had to suffer many times since the foundation of the world. But now he has appeared one time at the end of the ages for the removal of sin by the sacrifices of himself. Remember, the law, the sacrifices, that never removed the sin. Okay? It purified you outwardly to be able to approach to worship. It did not remove the sin. That's the whole thing we've been looking at for numerous weeks now. So, we could say it like this. With a greater sacrifice and a greater covenant is greater time. It's for a greater time and a greater purpose. So, because remember, we're talking about the complete removal of the sin in light of the end, not just a purification, an outward purification. So we get to verse 27, it says, and just as it is appointed for people to die once, and after this judgment, this is the verse that's oftentimes ignored the context, okay? Spoiler alert. And after this judgment, so also Christ, having been offered once to bear the sins of many, will appear a second time, not to bear sin, but to bring salvation to those who are waiting for him. So some very interesting things. We're going to have to break it up into pieces. First off, this verse is oftentimes used out of context. I think everybody's aware of that. It's usually used when people are trying to witness, right? They'll say, it's appointed for man once to die, and then the judgment. And people bring it up in when they're trying to witness to people. Or maybe sometimes people use it as like a fear tactic kind of thing, where they're just trying to make somebody feel scared so they'll get saved, like kind of badger them into the kingdom. And in both of these cases, it's not, it's true, like it applies, but that's not really what it's talking about. It's actually explaining why Christ only had to die one time instead of repeatedly over and over again, like the old covenant sacrifices had to. That's the whole purpose of this verse being here. So we have this saying, you only live once, where I already brought it up, and that's not overly true if you think about it. You only die once. You live every day. And when you do that, there's judgment, or another word for judgment in this context would be consequences. So, for instance, if you put your trust in God, your judgment would be blessings, right? So judgment isn't always a bad thing in the context. But obviously for someone who has, like, remember, the Hebrews, they're wanting to go back to Judaism. They're wanting to leave Jesus and go back to Judaism. So for them, the judgment would be bad. But for those who stood the line and sought after God, it would be a good thing. So let's kind of move a little bit forward, and then we'll go back to the verse that's that verse again. So Christ also died one time, and then the judgment of man will come. There's this little bit of a contrast here going on. People die once, Christ died one time. Then the judgment of man will come. Then the person is judged. Then the judgment of man will come. So you see there's kind of a contrast between the way of man and Jesus taking on the way of man. But if you notice in the end of verse 20, let me find it. The end of verse 28, the emphasis is actually not on people going to hell or anything like that, it's interesting because it puts the emphasis on salvation. Look at this. Will appear a second time, not to bear the sin, that's what he did the first time, but to bring salvation to those who are waiting for him. Now, I grew up in the church, and I've noticed there's a predominant thing that happens oftentimes. We focus on the negative aspects of salvation instead of the positive aspects. Have you noticed we do that sometimes? So like with the second coming, you better get ready because the second coming, it's like always put in this negative context. And not that that's not right. I mean, yeah, you should get ready. Jesus is coming again, absolutely. But I think sometimes we overlook the good part of that for the judgment part of that. You know what I mean? There's a whole other side of that where God is going to be there for those who have waited for him. We've held the line, we've sought him, we've trusted in him through all life's trials, and we're going to be saved. He's not just going to leave us in the lurch. I mean, this is good news. Okay. One more thing I wanted to say about that. Let me make sure I didn't skip it. So it says here, he did this, will appear as second time, not to, oh wait, where is it? Okay, here. So also Christ, having been offered once to bear the sins of many. Notice how it says not to bear the sins of all. I'm sure most of you are acquainted with the idea that's going around. A lot of times, there's a lot of different heresies that are old, but they're going around again and again and again. And one of those heresies is the idea that Jesus is saving everybody. That makes sense? So the salvation is pretty much you becoming enlightened to your potential and worth. It's not you accepting Jesus as a substitute for your sin. Does that kind of make sense? It's kind of like they're using the same words, but the words have a whole different meaning. It's like it's kind of like what cults do. They'll use the same words, but it just has a complete different meaning. When they talk about sin, they're not really talking about a moral wrong that is against God's character. Sin becomes more of something that holds you back from your worth, just something that's keeping you from your empowerment. When they talk about grace, they're not really talking about God giving you something you don't deserve. They're more of talking about you walking in peace. You know, all these different things, they're just using the same words, but they're really being rebranded here. And so Hebrews really does address at least one of those heresies by saying the sins of many, not the sins of all. So that takes us into a whole other argument with Calvinism, so let me just break this down. First off, Jesus came for all, but not all will be saved. The Calvinists teach this. They say that he came only for those who would believe. So like Baptists traditionally are Calvinists. I don't know if I've met any Baptists who aren't Calvinists, but traditionally they are. And in Calvinism, you know, there's this whole idea that pretty much he came and he died for those who would be saved, not for everybody. And then there's another thought, and I wish I could remember what it's called, but it says that, yes, Jesus didn't only come for everybody, but all will be saved. Universalism, that's what it's called. So even people who die, they'll get another chance, and like maybe after they die, or maybe God will only punish them for a while, or whatever. Somehow they're going to end up in heaven, or they're just going to be given into what's it called, like the oneness, where they don't exist as an individual anymore. And all these things are definitely not condoned in Hebrews. Because yes, he did come to bear the sins of many, so not everybody will be saved, but those who accept, they have to believe they will be saved. So then Calvinism also teaches that if people fall into sin, if somebody was saved and they leave the faith, it's because they were never really saved in the first place. Well, once again, Hebrews already showed us that that's not accurate, because it wouldn't have given us that warning. It is impossible to renew such a person if they hadn't been there in the first place. Why would it even give a warning if it wasn't possible, right? So, hey, make sure you don't leave the faith. Oh, you can't leave the faith, by the way. Oh, thanks for giving me that pointless warning. But the whole reason of Hebrews existing is to give a warning to these Jews that are wanting to go back to Judaism. So, we see a lot of different things here that Hebrews addresses. So they do not have to believe. They still get the choice of believing or not believing. Okay, so Christ will return as his resurrected self. Okay, so this is the other thing I wanted to say. When Christ returns, will appear a second time, not to bear sin, but to bring salvation to those who are waiting for him. When Christ returns again, he's going to come as his resurrected self. See, Jesus was not something, and then he became something that he wasn't. He became man. He always was God, but he became man, which he previously was not. And then he died, and he still has a resurrected body, and he's still fully God. So when he comes back, he's going to come with his resurrected body. Okay? So just to kind of clarify, because these are some things that Jehovah's Witnesses teach, so I need to make sure that we really address it. First off, God's not going to come in spirit. Okay, he's going to come physically. The Bible makes this absolutely clear in many places, but one of those places it says, "For just as I left, so I will also come back." You're going to see it from one side of the sky to the other side of the sky. It's absolutely clear there. Jehovah's Witness teaches that he's coming spiritually, that he's already come. The kingdom of heaven is already here. These kinds of things are absolutely not biblically warranted. Another idea is that he'll come and fall in flesh again. No, he's already has the resurrected body. That's why we have the hope of the resurrected body, because he has been resurrected. So he's not going to come again in the fallen flesh. He's going to come again in the resurrected flesh. Let's see what else. Also, he is not going to come in his pre-incarnate state. So the state that he was in from the beginning of time, from before the beginning of time, he's not going to come in that state. He's going to come in his resurrected body. And something interesting, one thing before we move on, is there's a growing number of Christians in our culture who believe in reincarnation. Karma too, but we're not talking about karma. Who believe in reincarnation. So basically, you get to come back and try again, all these different things, and it builds on karma, the whole idea of how well you do, it kind of adds to your blessings or whatever. But in Hebrews is another thing that pretty much talks where it can't really happen. I mean, he just said it is appointed for people to die once. It's really hard to get around that and say, well, die once, but then you're reborn and you die once again for that body. And no, because he says die once and after this judgment. Pretty much doesn't give any other possibility. Especially when you combine it with other parts of the scripture. Like you could still, and cultists do this, you can still kind of twist it where you say, okay, yeah, so you die, and then that carnation of you is judged. And then you get reincarnated, and then that one dies and you're judged. And cults are real big and really twisting wording like that. But when you combine that with the rest of scripture, it's just not really a feasible option. It's not really possible. So let's discuss something before I summarize. We asked numerous months ago this question, and now we can finally answer. But before I answer, I want to hear you guys tell me what you think. How could a single sacrifice be sufficient for all time? Go. What do you guys think? Grace, go ahead. So you're saying he could be one. I'm not saying you're wrong. I'm not saying what you're getting at, though. So, okay. The reason why it was only one sacrifice necessary is because he was fully God. Okay, so because he was fully God and fully human without sin. Okay. Oh, so, okay, you're saying because of the absence of sin. Okay, so you're saying the superiority of the sacrifice itself. Okay, so because the sacrifice was sinless and because it was superior. Okay, good reasons. Good reasons. I'm glad I kind of probed you to get a little bit deeper because I wasn't getting what you were trying to say. Any other ideas? give you a little bit longer just in case anybody wants to say something. Okay, I have a list of 6 different things that I think we can see from everything we've read in Hebrews up to this point. The first reason, it seems, is because the covenant is superior. So when Jesus instituted the new covenant, this allowed for different rules. So yes, sacrifices had to be repeated by the old covenant, but Jesus established a new covenant which didn't have the same stipulations to it. It was a superior covenant. The second reason was because what Gracie was hinting at, the sacrifice itself was superior. So Jesus was perfect. He was fully human and fully God rather than an animal. In every way, he was superior. Hebrews has been telling us about all the different ways he's been superior. So in all those ways, yes, the sacrifice itself was superior. Third off, because man can only die once. It is impossible for anything else. So Jesus, as man, could only die once, just as it is appointed for man to die once. He's talking about how the priest had to go and offer it over and over again and offer somebody else's blood, but instead how Jesus went in one time and offered his own blood for just as it is appointed for man to die once and then the judgment. So that's one of his points that he's trying to make. It seems to me, I could be wrong, but it really seems like he's trying to say, because man can only die once, Jesus only had to die once, because it would have been impossible for anything else. So then the fourth thing, because Jesus never left the holy place as earthly priests do. See, for the old covenant, what happened is a priest went into the Holy of Holies, he did his thing, and then he left. But Jesus, as we've seen repeated all throughout Hebrews, did not follow that format. He went into the Holy of Holies, and then he sat down at the right hand of the Father. That's what it says. So he never left. He's there. Therefore, he didn't have to do it over again because he never left. And obviously the blood is still there being presented. So he did not do this to offer himself many times as the high priests enter the sanctuary yearly with the blood of another. So then we get to the fifth reason, I think. And if there's disagreement with any of my reasons, I'm not saying these things are beyond reproach. I could misunderstand something that happens. The fifth thing, because Jesus lives right now, he's alive to offer the blood, he's still covering us with blood. See what I mean? He's still in the Holy of Holy Place. The blood is still there. It's still being applied, like when people get saved, for instance. He's still there presenting the blood. And he's alive. So then the sixth and final thing that I think this section of Hebrews says, and once again, maybe I missed one, maybe I got a little off on one, because the blood itself is eternal and is offered in heaven. See, when the earthly priests offered that blood, it wasn't eternal. It did things like dried out, chipped off. But Christ's blood was eternal, and it was applied in the Holy of Holies in heaven, directly to the source, and so the same as he's eternal, his sacrifice is eternal, his blood is eternal. So this explains why it is good enough for that same sacrifice to be offered to those who are not yet born and not yet saved, because Christ still lives to offer his blood. So then the question becomes, well, hold on, what about the people before Christ came? Well, remember that they offered in faith, looking forward to what was to come. So think of it as their forgiveness was put on loan, if you will. I know this is kind of a poor wording, but just roll with me on it. And so then when Jesus actually came, even though they were dead, the thing the covenant they had signed before it was actually ratified was backdated to them. Does that kind of make sense? And I'm trying to use wording that maybe would help, but maybe I'm making it worse. So let me make sure I'm not missing anything here. So this is partly why it's sufficient for all sins, but still, this is something that we have to weigh against. In Numbers, it tells us that there's no forgiveness for willful sins. When an Israelite set their heart to break the law on purpose, see what I mean? There was no forgiveness for that. So that brings us to this, and we have to figure out, how can we rectify that with Numbers? Is there a point that you can cross where God will no longer forgive you, or isn't there? And this is something we have to answer it to really be able to, move on. If we could just forget about the book of Numbers, this wouldn't be an issue. But the thing is, this book is referencing the book of Numbers, so we can't just ignore that book. We're not going to look at that tonight, maybe sometime in the future, but that's just more something that we just kind of have to weigh. Because then it takes us to a whole nother question. Can you go to heaven with unforgiven sins? So basically, there's like in this view, I don't hold to this view, but there is a view where, so basically you're forgiven from for salvation's sake, where you go to heaven, but then you still have some sins that God doesn't forgive you for, but you don't lose your salvation from. For instance, if you don't forgive somebody, God doesn't forgive you, but you still get into heaven. I don't think there's much of a warrant for that, but there are people who hold to that view. I'm just kind of referencing it. It just kind of seems like a can of worms. I think that if for no other reason you find yourself start stepping back and back and back, and pretty soon morals don't even mean anything. So I don't know. I could be wrong on that one too. So has something changed? Let's skip that. Okay. Even in the Old Testament, there was one. The other question we're going to answer now. This is the last of the different questions. Why one sacrifice for all the different kinds of sins? Well, even in the Old Testament, there was one sacrifice for the sin, right? There was a sin offering. They had 5 different sacrifices. I'm not talking about that, but I'm saying each different sacrifice had a reason, right? And there was only one sacrifice for any of the sins. It says, when any of my people sin and do this, offer this, right? It says it in Leviticus and in Numbers as well. So, that's something that it was even a thing in the Old Testament. How much more in the New Testament would Christ's sacrifice cover all the different kinds of sins? So, obviously there is an implied warning in this. And this is the last thing I want to say about Hebrews chapter 9, verse 28. There is an implied warning in this, actually 2 different implied warnings, that they will be judged for whatever they decide to do moving forward. Like, you can go back to Judaism if you want, but there's going to be consequences for that. And it says, die once, and after this judgment, kind of, hey, there is something coming here, guys. And then to bring salvation to those who are waiting for him. Are you waiting for him, or are you going back to Judaism? So the summary of all this that we looked at, we could just say Christ's purification is eternal. I think that pretty well summarizes everything we looked at. Before we close out here, are there any questions about anything that we talked about, or anything that somebody wanted to offer? Let's give you a couple minutes here. Okay. If there is anything you think of later, don't forget the question box, and we can always come back to it later.